At 8:47 on a Tuesday morning, Walter Crane walked into a conference room with grease still under his fingernails. The bank had already decided what his father's garage was worth, and the number they named didn't include the concrete floor where he learned to fix engines at 12 years old. What nobody in that room understood was that the same hands turning rusted wrenches had spent 7 years solving a problem the defense industry had been failing at for decades. The convoy that pulled into the parking lot at 9:13 a.m. wasn't there to save him. It was there to make the people trying to take his home understand exactly what they had almost destroyed. The conference room was on the 4th floor of a building that had been renovated in 2019 with walnut tables and glass walls that looked out over a parking lot Walter couldn't afford to park in. He wore the same canvas jacket he had worn to work every morning for 6 years. The zipper was failing on the left side. The collar was dark with oil that had never fully washed out. 4 people from the bank sat on the far side of the table, and a notary sat at the corner with her stamp already within reach. Diane Voss was the senior recovery officer, and she moved through foreclosures with the calm efficiency of someone who had stopped seeing the properties years ago. Diane had never walked through Walter's garage. She had never stood on the concrete floor where Elias Crane had taught his son to listen to an engine the way a doctor listens to a heartbeat. She had assigned a liquidation value based on square footage, zoning, and comparable sales of distressed industrial properties within a 40-mile radius. The number she presented was lower than the cost of the walnut table. Walter had inherited the garage and the balloon note from his father 8 years earlier. The note had matured in March. The refinancing that had been verbally promised by a loan officer who no longer worked at the branch had never materialized on paper, and the bank's legal team had concluded that the property was eligible for expedited collection. Walter hadn't hired an attorney. The retainer alone would have cost more than his daughter's school tuition for the semester, and he had chosen to believe that showing up in person, explaining the situation, and asking for the extension they had already discussed would be enough. He was wrong. Diane explained the terms with a voice that wasn't unkind. The bank would offer a 30-day extension in exchange for immediate vacancy, tool liquidation, and a signed waiver of any future claim to the property or its contents. The tools would be assessed by a third-party liquidator. The apartment upstairs, where Walter and his daughter had lived for 8 years, would be classified as an unlawful dwelling and subject to separate code enforcement. Walter didn't touch the pen she slid across the table. He looked at the window. The sky was the color of old aluminum, the kind of gray October sky that promised rain without delivering it. 3 blocks away, his daughter was sitting in a classroom on the 2nd floor of a school built in 1954. She had asked him that morning whether they would still be living upstairs next month, and he had told her yes, because that was what fathers say when they don't yet know the answer. Walter turned back to Diane Voss. He asked one question. His voice was quiet, the same voice he used when a customer brought in a car that had been misdiagnosed by 3 other shops, and he needed to explain what was actually wrong without embarrassing anyone. "Has anyone from your institution ever walked through that garage?" Diane smiled. It was the smile of someone who had been trained to acknowledge the emotional weight of a question without actually answering it. She said that the bank's assessment process was comprehensive and that the property had been evaluated by qualified professionals. Walter nodded. He stood and picked up his keys from the table. The key ring held 4 keys: the apartment, the garage side door, the lift control, and the back room that his father had added a deadbolt to in 1987. He put them in his jacket pocket. He didn't sign the extension, and he didn't sign the waiver. He walked out of the conference room with nothing settled and nothing decided, and the bank's deadline still ticking toward 9 o'clock tomorrow morning. 3 neighbors had driven to the bank and were waiting in the parking lot. A retired machinist named Harold, who had worked for Elias Crane in the 1990s. A woman named Patricia, who brought her Honda to Walter every spring for the same 10-point inspection. They didn't ask what had happened inside. They simply watched him cross the lot, and they followed his truck back to the garage in a procession that looked like a funeral without a body. 8 months before the story truly begins, Walter found a box in the crawl space above the apartment. It contained his father's work gloves, a set of feeler gauges wrapped in oil-stained cloth, and a photograph of Elias Crane standing in front of the garage in 1973. The building was new then. The paint was bright. Elias was 29 years old. which was the same age Walter had been when he became a single father. The garage had started as a general repair shop in a town that no longer existed the way it had in 1973. The factory that had employed half the neighborhood had closed in 2001. The grocery store 2 blocks south had become a payday loan center. The elementary school 3 blocks east was still open, but the playground equipment hadn't been replaced since 1998. The garage had outlasted all of it because Elias Crane had never tried to be more than what he was. He fixed transmissions. He rebuilt differentials. He diagnosed electrical problems that stumped dealerships. And he did it for prices that allowed people to keep driving to jobs that didn't pay enough. Walter had grown up in the space underneath the lifts. At 12 years old, he held the drop light while his father traced a transmission failure by sound alone. Elias could hear the difference between a worn synchronizer and a failing bearing. He could tell whether a knock was coming from the wrist pin or the rod end by placing his hand on the valve cover and waiting for the vibration to speak. Walter learned that precision wasn't about speed. It was about refusing to guess. When Walter was 29, his wife left. She didn't leave because of the garage. She left because she was 27 and had married too young and wanted a life that didn't smell like engine cleaner. Walter didn't argue. He didn't hire a lawyer to fight for custody he couldn't afford. He simply took their daughter upstairs, converted the second bedroom into a space that held a bed and a desk and a shelf for books, and went back to work the next morning. That was 8 years ago. The garage shifted slowly from Elias's general repair practice to Walter's specialty. Walter had started reading engineering journals at the public library during lunch breaks. He didn't have a degree. He had a high school diploma, 14 years of hands-on experience, and a particular gift for seeing stress patterns in metal that other people couldn't see. The thermal fatigue problem that would eventually bring the Convoy to his door started as a curiosity. A consulting engineer had brought in a prototype component from a defense subcontractor, a thermal shield that cracked under repeated heat cycles, and had asked Walter whether he could figure out why. Walter figured it out in 11 days. He solved it by watching how an engine block distributes thermal load across its casting surfaces, a principle he had learned at 16 by staring at a cracked block for 3 hours until the pattern made sense. The solution wasn't exotic. It was a composite layering technique that used materials already common in aerospace manufacturing, arranged in a geometry that no one had bothered to try because the problem had always been approached from the wrong direction. He didn't patent it immediately. He built a second prototype, then a third, then 6 generations of refinement in the back room that his father had deadbolted in 1987. Testing each version against heat cycles that simulated conditions the original designers had never fully replicated. The community didn't know about the prototypes. They knew that Walter Crane would tell you honestly whether your car was worth saving. They knew that he wouldn't charge you for a part you didn't need. They knew that his daughter sometimes sat in the office after school doing homework while her father worked underneath a car, and that the office smelled like coffee and cutting oil, and the particular calm of a space where competence was the only currency that mattered. At 6:45 every evening, Walter climbed the stairs to the apartment above the garage and made dinner. The kitchen was narrow, with a stove that had been installed in 1985 and a refrigerator that hummed at a frequency you stopped noticing after 3 days. Walter cooked simple meals because he didn't have time for complex ones. His daughter set the table with the same precision she applied to her math homework, which was to say that everything had a place and she noticed when it was wrong. They talked about school. They talked about the neighbors. They didn't talk about the bank. At 8:30, Walter checked her homework. At 9 o'clock, he enforced bedtime with the same firmness he applied to torque specifications, because children need sleep and fathers need to know that the person upstairs is safe before they go back downstairs to the work that waits. At 9:30, Walter descended to the garage alone. The main bay was dark except for the single bulb he left burning over the bench. The lifts were silent. The tools were hung on the wall in the order his father had established and Walter had maintained, which meant that you could find anything in the dark if you had spent enough years in that room. The back room was behind a steel door with a deadbolt his father had installed in 1987. Walter unlocked it. Inside, the space was 10 feet by 12, with a workbench along the far wall and shelves that held prototype units in various stages of completion. The first 3 generations had been made from scrap aluminum and ceramic fiber he had ordered from a supplier in Ohio. The 4th generation used a composite layering technique that distributed thermal load the way an engine block distributes combustion stress, and that was the version that had caught the attention of the defense contractor's engineering team. The prototypes sat under tarps in the back corner. Walter labeled each unit with grease pencil notations that only he could read, a shorthand of temperatures and cycle counts and failure modes that documented 6 years of trial and error. The 6th generation was the one that worked. It had survived 472 simulated heat cycles without a single crack, a performance margin that exceeded the original specification by a factor Walter had calculated but never spoken aloud. The defense contractor had found him through the consulting engineer. Their acquisition team had spent 6 months reviewing his documentation, testing their own copies of the prototype, and running due diligence that Walter had participated in through encrypted email and 2 site visits by men who arrived in rental cars and didn't explain who they worked for. The final acquisition terms had been agreed upon 3 weeks ago. The federal filing that would classify the garage as a site of active national interest development was in motion. Walter knew the filing would clear. He also knew that the bank's legal team had scheduled a locksmith for 9 o'clock tomorrow morning, 13 minutes after the federal filing window was projected to close. The bank didn't know about the filing. The defense contractor didn't know about the locksmith. Walter was the only person who could see both timelines converging on the same concrete floor. He checked the prototypes one last time. He turned off the light. He locked the steel door and climbed the stairs to an apartment that smelled like his daughter's shampoo and the leftover heat from the stove. The clock was running. At 7:15 the next morning, someone knocked on the garage door who shouldn't have been there. Walter had already brewed coffee and packed his daughter's lunch. She was brushing her teeth upstairs. He opened the side door to find a man in a charcoal suit holding a leather folder that looked like it had never been carried in a vehicle with fewer than 200 horsepower. The man wasn't from Diane Voss's office. He was from an external legal team the bank had hired to accelerate distressed property liquidations, and his job was to remove obstacles before they became expensive. He smiled the way people smile when they have already decided that you will say yes. He offered $4,200 for the contents of the workshop. He called it a courtesy buyout. He explained that it would simplify the handover by removing Walter's legal standing to contest the seizure of his tools as business assets. The liquidator scheduled for later in the day wouldn't need to inventory individual wrenches and diagnostic equipment if Walter signed a bill of sale now. The man opened his folder and produced a check that had already been filled out. Walter recognized the tactic. His father had warned him about it 30 years ago. How predatory lenders would try to strip collateral before the formal process began, how they would offer pennies for tools that took decades to accumulate, how they would frame it as a convenience when it was actually a legal maneuver designed to leave you with nothing to fight over. Elias Crane had seen it happen to a competitor in 1994. The man had accepted the check. 3 days later, he had been locked out of a shop that had been in his family for 2 generations. Walter didn't invite the man inside. He said that he wasn't selling his tools. He said it the way a person states a fact they find neither satisfying nor entertaining. The man in the charcoal suit mentioned inventory liquidation and streamlined handover. He used the word expedite twice. Walter stood in the doorway and didn't move. His daughter appeared at the top of the stairs. She was wearing her school uniform, a blue sweater and gray skirt that she had outgrown slightly at the wrists. She didn't say anything. She simply stood there, watching her father talk to a man in a charcoal suit who was trying to buy their life for less than the cost of a used sedan. The man looked up at her. He looked back at Walter. Something in his expression shifted. It wasn't sympathy exactly. It was the discomfort of a person who had been trained to see transactions instead of lives, suddenly confronted with the fact that lives were present. He placed the check on the workbench near the door. He said that the offer would remain open until the bank's representative arrived at 9 o'clock. Then he walked to his car, a silver sedan that had been parked at an angle blocking the driveway, and he drove away without looking back. Walter didn't touch the check. He made his daughter breakfast. He scrambled eggs in the pan his mother had given Elias in 1975. He toasted bread and poured orange juice and asked about the math test she was nervous about. And he did all of this with the particular calm of a man who has already done the math and knows that the answer isn't on the check sitting downstairs. At 8:10, he drove her to school. The route was 3 blocks east and 2 blocks north, past the Payday Loan Center and the closed grocery store and the school built in 1954. She asked him whether he would be home when she got back. He said yes. He watched her walk through the front doors with her backpack that was too heavy for her shoulders, and then he drove back to the garage and waited. At 9:05, the first black SUV turned onto the street. It didn't use a siren. It didn't use flashers. It moved at the speed of a vehicle whose occupants are not in a hurry because they have already arranged the world to their timetable. 3 more SUVs followed it, then 2 more behind them. 6 vehicles in a single file, each one polished to a finish that reflected the gray October sky like dark mirrors. They parked in a line across the bank's side lot. The arrangement was precise. The lead vehicle blocked the driveway that the locksmith's van was supposed to use. The second vehicle angled slightly to prevent anyone from pulling around. The remaining 4 formed a perimeter that looked less like a parking job and more like a statement. Diane Voss saw them from the conference room window on the 4th floor. She was preparing for a 9:30 meeting with the liquidator, and she assumed the SUVs belonged to a corporate client whose portfolio she didn't recognize. She didn't look at the plates. If she had, she might have noticed that they weren't local. 2 men in dark suits emerged from the lead vehicle. They didn't enter the bank. They walked across the street to Walter's garage, where the side door was already open and Walter was standing in the doorway with a cup of coffee in a mug that his daughter had given him 3 years ago. The mug read, "World's Okayest Mechanic," in letters that were starting to fade from repeated washing. The lead representative was a man in his 50s with the posture of someone who had spent years in military service before transitioning to civilian consulting. He didn't shake Walter's hand immediately. He looked past him into the garage. He saw the lifts, the tool cabinets, the wall of organized parts, and the tarps in the back corner that covered objects he had read about in classified briefings but had never seen in person. Then he extended his hand, and Walter shook it. The documentation was simple. A federal notice of strategic asset acquisition had been filed at 8:58 a.m., 2 minutes before the bank's formal seizure deadline and 13 minutes before the locksmith's appointment. The filing classified the garage and its contents as a site of active national interest development. Any interference with its operation, any attempt to remove tools or materials, or restrict access to the premises now required federal clearance that couldn't be obtained through a county court's collection docket. The bank's legal team didn't know this yet. Diane Voss received a phone call at 9:22 a.m. The voice on the other end used terminology she hadn't encountered in 15 years of foreclosure law. Strategic Technology Holding. Federal Protective Filing. Cease all pending collection activity pending interagency review. She asked for clarification twice. The second time, the voice on the other end repeated the same words more slowly, the way you speak to someone who isn't refusing to understand, but simply lacks the framework to process what they're hearing. She walked to the window. The convoy hadn't moved. The 6 black SUVs sat in their precise line across the side lot, and the lead vehicle's driver was standing beside the front fender with his arms crossed, watching the bank's entrance the way a person watches a door they don't expect anyone to exit through. Walter was still in his garage doorway. He was talking to the man from the convoy in the same canvas jacket he had worn to Diane's conference room. His hands were in his pockets. His posture was the posture of a man who wasn't celebrating a victory because he had never considered the possibility of defeat. Diane Voss crossed the street alone. Her assistant tried to follow her to the elevator, and she told him to stay. She walked through the lobby, past the walnut tables and the glass walls, and out into the gray October air that still hadn't delivered the rain it had promised. The convoy didn't react to her presence. The driver beside the lead vehicle simply watched her pass without changing his expression. Walter saw her coming. He didn't step back into the garage. He didn't straighten his posture or adjust his jacket or perform any of the small gestures that people use when they're preparing to receive someone they have defeated. He simply stood in the doorway and waited. The lead representative stepped back. This wasn't his conversation. He had delivered the filing. He had confirmed the protective status. The remaining negotiation between the bank and the property holder was a matter he would observe but not intervene in. And his retreat was a professional courtesy that also happened to place him at a distance where he could see both faces clearly. Diane stopped 3 feet from the garage door. She looked at Walter first. She saw the same canvas jacket, the same grease under the fingernails, the same man she had offered 30 days and a tool liquidation to 4 hours ago. Then she looked past him into the garage, and for the first time, she saw the workshop. She saw the lifts that had been installed in 1988 and maintained so carefully that they still operated within original factory tolerance. She saw the tool cabinets with their drawers labeled in Walter's father's handwriting, labels that had been preserved and replicated when the original tape had worn through. She saw the wall of organized parts, bins sorted by size and application, a system that spoke of someone who had spent decades refining the process of finding what you needed without thinking about where to look. And she saw the tarps in the back corner. They were covered in dust and oil spots and the particular patina of a space where heavy work had been done for years. She hadn't asked about them in the conference room. The property assessment had listed the building's square footage and its zoning classification and its distressed market value. The report said nothing about tarps. It said nothing about a locked back room. It said nothing about the man sitting across from her in a canvas jacket with a failing zipper, or the 7 years he had spent solving problems that people with advanced degrees and government funding had been failing to solve. She asked the question she should have asked 8 weeks ago. "What do you actually do in here?" Walter answered with a single sentence. "I fix things that other people have given up on." The words weren't dramatic. They weren't framed as a challenge or a lesson. He said them the way he would tell a customer that their transmission needed a rebuild, or that their electrical fault was coming from the ground wire behind the dashboard, or that the noise they were hearing wasn't the power steering pump, but the idler bearing. He stated a fact that was simply true and required no defense. Diane looked at the tarps again. The specifics of her realization arrived not as a single insight, but as a cascade of smaller recognitions that accumulated weight as they connected. The bank's property assessment had valued the building at land plus scrap metal. The federal filing valued the intellectual property developed on that concrete floor at a figure she wasn't cleared to know, but she could read the implications in the lead representative's posture and in the 6-vehicle convoy that hadn't moved from her parking lot. Her team had walked the perimeter of the property 8 weeks ago. They had photographed the exterior, noted the faded paint, assigned a liquidation value, and moved on to the next file. Not one of them had looked under the tarps. Not one of them had asked about the locked back room. Not one of them had considered the possibility that the man who rebuilt transmissions in a dying industrial neighborhood had been building something else entirely. Something that made the garage more valuable than the bank that was trying to take it. The cost of her arrogance wasn't a financial penalty. It was the dawning understanding that her institution's procedure, the very efficiency she had been praised for, had made her blind to the very thing that would have made this account her division's most valuable holding. She had treated Walter Crane as a collection statistic. The federal government had treated him as a strategic asset. The gap between those two assessments was the measure of everything her team had gotten wrong. Walter didn't gloat. He didn't explain the prototypes. He didn't describe the heat cycles or the composite layering or the 11 days he had spent staring at a cracked thermal shield until the solution arrived in the form of a principle he had learned at 16. He simply sipped his coffee from the mug his daughter had given him, and he waited for Diane Voss to finish looking at the tarps she had never asked about. The convoy left at noon. The man in charge of the convoy shook Walter's hand one final time and informed him that a security consultant would arrive within 48 hours to install protocols for the back room. The filing protected the property, but it also restricted it. The prototypes were now subject to federal inventory requirements. The grease pencil notations on the tarps would be supplemented by labels that Walter didn't write, and the steel door with the deadbolt from 1987 would be reinforced with measures that hadn't existed when his father installed the original lock. Walter understood the trade. He had spent 30 years building value in shadows, and the federal filing had turned those shadows into light. The recognition wasn't the recognition he had sought. He hadn't built the prototypes for acclaim. He had built them because the problem was interesting, and because his father's garage had taught him that the right solution was worth whatever time it required, and because solving something that other people had abandoned was the only kind of victory that had ever mattered to him. His daughter came home from school at 3:45. She walked through the garage the way she always did, dropping her backpack on the bench and climbing the stairs without looking at the tarps. Walter was underneath a 2009 Toyota Corolla, replacing a catalytic converter that had been rattling since March. He slid out from under the car, wiped his hands on a rag, and asked about her math test. She had passed. The community learned what happened in fragments over the following week. Harold the machinist heard about the convoy from Patricia, who had seen it from her kitchen window. The retired machinist brought Walter a six-pack of beer on Thursday evening, and they sat on the garage steps and watched traffic pass without discussing the black SUVs, or the federal filing, or the woman from the bank who had crossed the street with an expression that Harold described as the look of someone who just read the last page of a book they thought they had written. Walter's life didn't change in the ways people imagined. The garage still opened at 7 a.m. The same customers still brought the same cars with the same problems. His daughter still needed help with math homework on Tuesday evenings. The coffee maker still produced the same thin coffee, and the refrigerator still hummed at the same frequency. And the concrete floor where Elias Crane had taught his son to listen to engines still carried the stains and scars of 40 years of work. The difference was subterranean. The weight of being seen sat on Walter's shoulders the way a heavy tool sits in a familiar hand. He had built his worth in anonymity, and the federal filing had removed the anonymity without asking whether he wanted it removed. He walked through the back room at 9:30 p.m. and saw the prototypes under their tarps, now bearing inventory numbers alongside his grease pencil notations, and he understood that the room was still his, but no longer only his. The question the story leaves open is whether the victory was worth the visibility. A man who has built his identity in shadows doesn't automatically know how to stand in light. The garage was still his home. His daughter still lived upstairs. The neighbors still brought him their cars, and he still told them honestly whether the repair was worth the cost. But the particular privacy that had allowed him to work without expectation, to fail and rebuild and fail again without anyone watching, was gone. Walter Crane still opens that garage at 7 every morning. The tools are still his. The daughter still lives upstairs. The tarp still covers something the rest of us wouldn't know how to see. And the convoy that arrived on a gray October morning didn't save him because he had never needed saving. It simply made the world pause long enough to notice what it had been walking past. The garage door still rolls up at 7 every morning, and Walter Crane is still underneath it. If you want to see what happens when the next quiet man the world ignored becomes impossible to ignore, stay with this channel. The next story is already waiting.